In this video, I'm going to show you how to place the front wheel bearing and the hub on this Toyota Camry. It is a pressed-on bearing, so you need either a press or a tool that will pull it off and reinstall it on the vehicle. Having said that, if you need this or any other part for your car, check us out at oneauto.com. Let's get started. If your vehicle has a locking lug nut, it should have one of these locking keys that goes on it. Find the correct slot, and I'm going to break this free by hand before I raise the vehicle up and use an air impact or electric on any of the other lug nuts. It is not recommended that you put an impact on that. So with a 21mm socket and a breaker bar, break this free. At this point, it is safe to put an impact on it because it's already broken free, and you basically just want to avoid the high force that the impact will put on this because it can break the little teeth internally. Now continue with your impact or tool of choice. 21mm socket, remove all the rest of your lug nuts. Remove your wheel. If it's stuck, give it a little tap. It should pop right off. The axle nut should be squished in a little bit, peened over right here, just to lock it. So take a punch that fits in there or any other tool that you might have and give it a few taps to hopefully raise this ridge up just a little bit. Now take a 30mm 12-point socket and remove your axle nut. If you don't have a powerful impact to do this with, it's going to take quite a bit of force by hand. You're going to want to either put the wheel back on and pop the center cap off, put this on the ground and just wrench it, or use the breaker bar, or you can put a pry bar between the studs, but if you have an impact, that is going to be a whole lot easier. There we go. Next, you want to make sure the axle pushes through the hub. This one is fairly stuck on here, so I want to take a rubber mallet and try to tap it through. There we go. Looks like it started to move. That's good. I'm going to spray some rust penetrant in there. Well, more, because I already sprayed it all over. And then I'm going to work it back and forth a little bit. Now, if this is really stuck for you, what you can do is either put the axle nut back on, flush, and then use a steel hammer, or take a punch right in the center there and punch it through. You want to make sure this moves so that when we pull the knuckle away, it doesn't separate the inner CV joint of the axle. Next, let's remove this 12mm bolt that holds on a couple brackets. Take the brake hose off, take the ABS wire bracket off, and then pop the ABS wire off of the strut. There we go. Next, we have to remove the tie rod end here, and this cotter pin looks like it's a little rusty. I'm going to try to get it straightened out and push through, but if I can't, I'm going to have to cut it flush. Looks like it's not really working out in my favor here. That broke off flush. Use a 17mm socket. If you're doing it this way, you're going to have to tap the socket onto the hammer. Now tap the side of the knuckle here. That should pop the tie rod free from the knuckle. There we go. Let's remove these two 17mm bolts that hold the caliper onto the knuckle. On this one, hold the caliper so it doesn't fall down. Pull it off the rotor and hang it to the side so it doesn't put any pressure on this brake hose. My rotor's stuck on here, so you can either use a hammer, tap right between the lug studs, or put some 8x125 bolts in here, and threading those into the rotor will actually push it off of the hub. Don't hammer on the braking surface. If you're going to reuse the rotor, that will damage it. Okay, there you go. Next, I'd like to take the ABS sensor out, and there's a 10mm bolt here that we have to pull off before the sensor can actually come off. There we go. Take this out. I'm going to spray some rust penetrant in here so that I can soak it down. Now I'm going to grab some pliers. With my pliers, I'm going to grab it right on the end here, spin it, and pull it straight out. Now let's remove the strut bolts that hold the strut onto the knuckle, 22 millimeter wrench on the bolt side, and 22 millimeter socket on the nut side. Sometimes they get seized in here, in which case you'd have to tap them out. I'm going to remove this one completely. Looks like someone's been in here before. Mine have anti-seize on them, which is a good thing. Take this one out as well. With those out, you should be able to pull the knuckle down, push the axle through. Okay, there we go. Let this sit like that. On this lower ball joint nut that we can now access, there is a cotter pin on this side. Mine looks like it's in pretty bad shape, so I have low expectations for it. I don't think it's going to come out. I'm going to try and wiggle it back and forth to break it free, but most likely I'm going to have to do exactly what I did with the tie rod, cut it flush, hammer a socket over it. Yeah, I think that's exactly what's going to happen here. Going to hammer in this end over here. Make it flush with the nut. Let's do the same to this side. You're going to need a 19 millimeter socket for this. And take it off. There's nothing holding this ball joint stud to the knuckle other than the pressure of it being pressed in there. So let's get a hammer, hold up on the knuckle and down on the control arm. Naturally, it's going to want to swing down, and this should pop free. There we go. With our knuckle on the workbench, let's remove this protective ring here with a pry bar, screwdriver, whatever you have, so that we can get to the snap ring that holds that wheel bearing in it down. This one is probably going to get a little bit bent, but that's okay. We can fix it afterwards. I'm going to spray some rust penetrant in here, hopefully let it soak into that groove. Okay, I'm going to try and wire brush this area here so I can expose as much of the snap ring as I can. It is super rusty in here, so I'm going to soak it down with rust penetrant. Now what I want to do is use my snap ring pliers and get them right into those grooves there. Try to squeeze the snap ring so I can hopefully get it out of here. Okay, that's pretty stuck. So what I'm going to do is take a punch and very gently tap this end of the snap ring to hopefully break it free. All right, that's broken free. I'm going to do the same to this one over here. Very, very gentle. I don't want to break it. We have movement on both. That's good. Now, let's get the pliers in here, squeeze this, and hopefully remove it. Yeah, watch your fingers. there it is. Now let's go to the press so we can press everything out. So here's what I have set up in my press. I have the knuckle with some supports here on a huge rotor so it can raise it off of the press base. And then I have a 27mm socket. I'm sure you could use a 30mm as well, or really anything that you have that'll press just on the hub, not on the bearing. And then just a couple spacers to space it out for my press setup here. Now, let's put some downward pressure and the hub should come out of the bearing. Yep, it's already pushing out. There it goes. There's that. Now I flipped the knuckle upside down because the bearing will come out through the backside. I'm going to take the inner race that is still in here, pop it out, and I'm going to put it right on top. And take a 36mm socket, punch that out. Get that ring off there. Put this right on top with your socket and a block. There's the bearing, and there's our knuckle. Let's go over back to the workbench and clean this all up. Now I'm going to take a very small wire wheel and stick it right inside the groove of that snap ring. I want to clean it all out. It was pretty rusty when the snap ring came out, and speaking of snap rings, I cleaned this one up. It is reusable, although I do always recommend getting a new one. If you don't have a new one, you can't source one, you can clean this one up, inspect it, and reuse it. Wipe this all off. You also want to make sure you clean right down in here where the wheel bearing bottoms out. If there's any debris, it won't go down all the way, so that would be an issue. Rinse it all off using some brake parts cleaner. All right, we're back at the press. The knuckle is cleaned up. It's ready to accept the new bearing, and here it is. I'm going to slide it on. I also have this set up on these two steel pieces that are perfectly flat. The way this is going to press in is from the backside here, and I'm going to use the old bearing to press in the new one. That is because you want to press on the outer race, not on the inner race. I'm going to put this in, and then I'm going to use this aluminum block here just as a spacer to take up the space, and also it'll help me press perfectly flat on this surface. That's set up. Let's apply some pressure. As you bring this down, you want to make sure it goes in even. If it starts going in at an angle, stop right away and try to correct that. Otherwise, you'll have bigger issues. It's bottomed out. Let's apply some pressure. That just bottomed out right there. That's perfect. Let's release pressure. It went in nice and smooth. Remove the old bearing, and that is a perfectly pressed in brand new bearing. Now it's time to press in the hub. And what I have set up here on the press is just a couple inner races that I saved. I stacked them and put them on an aluminum block just as a spacer. And then I'm going to put the hub down, and what those races are going to do that I have there is they're going to support the inner race on the bottom. At this point, we don't care about the outer race anymore. We want to support the inner race so that as we push this hub through, it doesn't pop out the inner races. Those races have plenty of space in order to pivot this knuckle around and support it. They also have enough clearance to accept the hub as it's poking through on the backside. So having said that, I'm going to put the hub in from the top. Now you can install this flipped around and basically press the knuckle into the hub if that's what you want to do. but I'm gonna do it this way. I also have an aluminum spacer here. I don't want to press anything on the studs. And I'm just going to center this up, make sure everything is as leveled as you can get it to be, and let's apply some pressure. That's starting to press in. Make sure it's nice and smooth. You can spin this around a little bit as you press this in to ensure that it doesn't bind up. If you can not spin this anymore while you're pressing the hub in, something is bound up, stop and fix the issue before you go all the way down in. I'm gonna keep going until this is completely bottomed out. Right here, give it one extra pump, spin it. It spins perfectly smooth, as you can see, so I'm going to release pressure. Remove all of my adapters here. Lift up the knuckle, and here is the knuckle with the new bearing and the new hub. Now let's get the snap ring in place. Doesn't matter which direction you put it in. If you have a new one, obviously, install your new one. Mine is in good condition, so I'm going to reuse it. I'm going to use my snap ring pliers to pinch this and then squeeze it and put it down into the groove. Just like that. Watch your fingers when you do this. It is pretty powerful. All right, that expanded nicely. It's seated in there. Tap this with a screwdriver gently. Yep, making sure it's seated. When you do this, if you have to tap it, make sure you don't tap the seal on the bearing. That looks perfect. And the last piece of the puzzle is going to be this collar here that sits around the bearing or around the snap ring in the knuckle. You just want to make sure you line up this hole with the ABS hole right here. And this, you can just take a rubber mallet and tap it down. Make sure it's seated properly. You're gonna have to hold one side while you tap the other side. That's fully seated. If you don't seat this properly, the axle, and especially that ABS tone ring that sits here, may come in contact with it and you'll have other issues. At this point, this knuckle is ready to go back on the vehicle. On the axle, I recommend putting some anti-seize or some type of grease on the splines at least, just so that it doesn't get seized onto the hub in the future. You don't have to go very thick on the coating, just a thin layer should do. Try to avoid getting it on the threads, just keep it on the splines. Now take your knuckle, put it on the ball joint stud. Let's get this mounting nut on. Let's snug it up now. The torque for this is going to be 91 foot-pounds. All right, that's torqued. Now the cotter pin slot needs to line up with the castle nut, which actually mine lines up perfectly. Most of the time they don't. So in that case, you have to continue tightening in order to get this to line up and not loosen. I got lucky on this one, it looks like, because it is pretty much spot on here. Having said that, I'm just going to put my cotter pin right through. There we go. I bend the other one down. However you bend it, you want to make sure that it's not in the way of the axle shaft that will be going right through here. Let's put the axle back in the knuckle. And then make sure it goes through the hub as you push this in to line it up with the strut. If it doesn't, give this a couple spins. That will make the splines line up just like that. Push this in, and I have a bolt ready. Just like that. That's going to temporarily secure it in place. Put in the second bolt on the bottom and the two mounting nuts. Grab your 22mm socket and let's tighten these up. I'm actually going to start with this top one, and that is because if I start with the top one, I can easily do this and push the knuckle in just a little bit. These bolts are not adjustable, but they do have a little bit of wiggle room to them, and I recommend that you start with them pushed in. You can let your alignment professional do the rest of the alignment adjustments after you're done with the job. So I'm holding that one with a wrench and snugging this one up. And once you do that, you can let go. The knuckle will stay exactly where you tightened it. Let's do this bottom one. The torque for these bolts is 214 foot-pounds. Grab your torque wrench and hold the bolt side if needed. I recommend torquing the nut side because that usually gives you a more accurate torque since you are overcoming the friction of the entire bolt. The torque wrench says it's torqued, but I did see the bolt spin a little bit, so I'm going to try this again while holding this. There we go. I want to make sure that it's actually tight. Let's do the same to the bottom one. There we go, that's tight. All right, now let's put on the axle nut. I'm gonna bottom it out with a power tool, and then the torque for this is 217 foot-pounds. There we go. Not too worried about over tightening it with this tool since it's such a high torque. Now I'm going to grab my socket and torque it, but in order to stop this from spinning, I'm actually going to put a pry bar through the lug studs. You can prop it on the ground. In my case, I'm going to try and prop it on the lift arm, but in order to torque this, you're going to need this to stop spinning. This is my setup here. Make sure that if you're using a pry bar like this, you have it put flat between the lug studs so that it doesn't actually destroy the threads. That's it right there. Now, if you remember when we took this axle nut off, we had to unstake it. Well, now we have to restake it, which is what's going to lock it in. The axle has this cutout here so that you can punch in the end of the axle nut, and that will prevent it from backing off by itself in case that happens. So take a punch or a chisel bit and a hammer and just punch it down a little bit. You don't have to completely smash it, but you just want to peen it over. That should be good right there. Now I'm going to coat this hub in some anti-seize, and I'm going to do that so that it doesn't rust in the future. Just a thin layer all around will do the job. I'm also going to focus right around the center of the hub here. That's where the rotor will also seize, a main contact point, and then a thin layer across the face of the hub. If you put too much, it will actually start flinging off as you drive, especially at highway speeds, and you want to avoid that. So you just want a coating enough to prevent rust, but not enough to actually get all over the rotor once you start driving. Try to avoid getting it on the lug studs. That will actually provide you with a false torque on the lug nuts, so that is not a good thing. These are already coated, they will not rust. Do not put any grease on them. I cleaned up the backside of my rotor since I'm reusing my old rotor. It had a little bit of rust built up, and I did not want to put that back like that because right here where the hub sits, if it's not perfectly flat, it's going to cause braking issues. So with that sanded down, I'm not worried about coating it because the anti-seize off of the hub will actually get on the rotor too. I'm going to slide this over, make sure that seats nicely just like that. Perfect. Now take your caliper, slide it over the rotor. Those pads, if they don't fit, put them at an angle like this, and then just push it on. I have my bolts ready to go here. Once the bolt holes line up on the caliper, start them in by hand. .79 foot-pounds is the torque for both of these bolts. And 2. Let's get these brackets back on here for the ABS and the brake hose. They kind of sandwich together like that. There was a 12mm headed bolt holding these onto the strut. I recommend greasing this bolt up or putting anti-seize on the threads because a lot of times these do rust. Make sure that's snug. Put this retainer back in the knuckle. This is for the ABS sensor. You want to make sure that wire is properly secured. To reinstall the ABS sensor, I recommend putting some grease right on the base of it right there. I already did. This will hopefully prevent it from getting stuck in the knuckle in the future. Line it up with the hole, get the bolt, and start it in. When you tighten this bolt down, just give it about 1/8 of a turn after it bottoms out. You don't need to go any more than that because if you do, it's over tightened, it can break easily. That's it right there, just snug. You can also crack the housing or the ear, retaining ear off of this ABS sensor if you over tighten it. You want to try to avoid that. As long as it's properly seated all around, nice and flush, you're good to go. Now take your tie rod, put it in through the knuckle. Make sure that stud goes all the way down. Move the knuckle if needed. Let's get that castle nut back on. If your cotter pin broke like mine did at the beginning, or you had to cut it, make sure you drill that out. Hopefully that is not the case for you though. Start this on by hand, snug it up. The torque for this is 36 foot-pounds. The trick here is that when you finish torquing it, you want that cotter pin slot to line up with the slot on the castle nut. If it does not, continue tightening, not loosening, to get it to line up. So technically I am torqued there, but I will check the slot and it does not line up. I have to keep going a little bit. A little bit more. All right, that's perfectly lined up for me right there. So I'm gonna get the cotter pin through, just like that, and leave a little bit of wiggle room in the cotter pin. If you make it nice and tight up against that castle nut, it is more likely to seize in place. If it can move around a little bit, it will not. So now take some pliers or whatever you have, and you wanna make sure you bend this cotter pin all the way up so that it is out of the way of anything that it may come in contact with, and you also want it to be locked in. There we go, just like that. That's tight. Let's get the wheel back on. Put on all 5 of your lug nuts, bottom them out, and then we'll torque them in a cross pattern to 76 foot-pounds. Once again, 76 foot-pounds in a cross pattern. There you have it. Don't forget to get an alignment. I hope you enjoyed this video and I hope it was helpful. If you have anything to say, leave it in the comment section below. And as always, don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell so you can stay up to date with all of our latest content. Thanks for watching.